I don't think it's blowing anyone's mind at this point when I say that George A. Romero's 1968 horror classic Night of the Living Dead is very much a political film looking at racial tensions in America during the 1960s. In what was perhaps one of the most, if not the most, serendipitous case of colorblind casting in cinema, Romero's decision to cast complete unknown Dwayne Jones as the film's protagonist Ben transformed the text of the film from simply being about how the real villains are the people because they can't work together and will dig each other over at the first opportune moment, to a film about how racial tensions, and more specifically flat-out racism, is the literal downfall of society, with the film's for all intents and purposes flesh, blood, and living villain Mr. Cooper standing in for both white supremacy and patriarchy, who repeatedly lashes out, argues, and attempts sabotage whenever his authority as the dictator of the group is questioned. I don't really feel the need to talk about all that. It's so apparent within the film that it's basically not even subtext, but rather the film's text itself. However, I do want to talk about how Night of the Living Dead shows us broader feelings of the American progressive downfall, or declension as I shall refer to it for reasons that will become apparent, and how the film can be seen as part of the prevailing mood in the American New Left at the time. But before we can understand that, we have to look at the context in which Night of the Living Dead itself was made. Living Dead is often thought of as being part of the New Hollywood era of filmmaking. New Hollywood films attempted to rebel against many of the facets of old American cinema, both stylistically and morally, often portraying protagonists occupying morally grey spaces and attempting to shoot in a more realistic manner, favouring on-location shooting and more realistic depictions of both violence and sex than one could usually get away with. Let's look at Roger Ebert's review of an early work of New Hollywood cinema, 1967's Bonnie and Clyde. Quote, "This is a film that is aimed squarely and unforgivingly at the times we are living in. It is intended, horrifically, as entertainment. The violence in most American movies is of a curiously bloodless quality. But, in Bonnie and Clyde, however, real people die. Before they die, they suffer. Horribly. Before they suffer, they laugh and play checkers and make love, or try to." There were multiple factors in the creation of New Hollywood and its desire to rebel against the typicals of American filmmaking. The breakup of the vertically integrated studio system resulted in a more fragmented production process, which, intentionally or otherwise, allowed a new generation of auteurs to experiment with a lot less oversight. And there was a lot of influence being taken from other various burgeoning foreign cinema scenes, with particular note to the French and British new waves, which many of these New Hollywood directors took inspiration from. However, the third major factor in the creation of this new school of filmmaking was indeed the broader political upheavals that had taken place during the early parts of the decade. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the free speech movement, and New Left activism and counterculture as a whole shaped these filmmakers' desire for revolution, both artistically and politically, not only embellishing their films with broader political textures, but rebelling against what had been the received formula for American movies dating back to the birth of the talkies. However, as we're about to see, the late 60s and early 70s, the New Hollywood period, weren't the best times to be a progressive in America.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
1968 was a tumultuous year across the world, and it was no exception for America. The year began with the infamous Tet Offensive, in which Viet Cong and NVA forces launched a surprise attack on the US and South Vietnamese forces on the holiday of Tet, and it only got worse from there. In April, Martin Luther King was assassinated from his hotel balcony, something that was to be followed up 2 months later by the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. The riots in the Democratic National Convention in August, with the year culminating with the final insult, that being the election of President Richard Nixon. The hope and optimism of the first half of the decade that had been characterized by sit-ins, the war on poverty, and the passing of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act were gone, only to be replaced by a new reactionary status quo. This is what's known as the Declension narrative of the US 60s and the New Left. Now, there's a lot of excellent revisionist scholarship essentially challenging this narrative, correctly arguing that the timeline negates the progress made by the women's movement, particularly that of women of color, the LGBT rights movement, the American Indian movement, and more subtle but granted not particularly substantial gains in American race relations. All this is true, but it doesn't stop the fact that new leftists recount feelings of doom and pessimism mounting in 1968, and Night of the Living Dead captures this apocalyptic feeling like few other films do. One of the main reasons why the film was so shocking was not just its more realistic depictions of violence, but also the manner in which it was filmed. Romero was heavily influenced by contemporary news footage, shooting largely handheld in black and white and 4:3.
You know, in those days, The news was in black and white, and black and white was the medium. It was much more realistic then.
Have been returning to life and committing acts of murder.
The film was meant to feel like news footage, that it could be real. There's even diegetic news footage within the film, and it's shot almost identically to the rest of the movie. This realism was combined not only with the film's then shocking acts of violence, but also the deliberate usage of at the time contemporary political iconography to create a kind of dark mirror of reality.
You cannot not think of the kind of freedom marches in the South. You can't not think about the civil rights struggle.
In the final scenes of the film, the footage of the police attempting to eradicate the zombies can be compared with photographs and footage of police breaking up civil rights protests. Romero shows us the police using attack dogs, an infamous method of suppression used by police earlier in the decade. Later on, the film puts the audience in mind of southern lynch mobs, with members of the public walking through the landscape clutching their guns. All these scenes are shot with the same verite style in order to keep the audience in mind of the American reality. At the end of the film, the protagonist, Ben, is shot dead by an uncaring member of the mob, after which his body is dragged out of the house and burnt in a manner that is reminiscent of the burning of black bodies after a lynching. Romero has described the titular living dead as being metaphorical. They are the new society devouring the old.
Just thought it was great. I thought it was, this idea of, a revolution or something devouring, a new society devouring the old completely and just changing everything.
Living Dead shows the breakdown of society followed by its restoration, which is viewed as irreparably corrupted, as illustrated by Ben's senseless murder and Mr. Cooper's inability to cooperate with Ben. The movie is apocalyptic in nature. It shows us a vision of a zombie apocalypse, but also the futility of changing the status quo, the racism entrenched into the fabric of American society. The sense of doom that Romero captures is only partly a result of the impending presence of the living dead. The rest of it comes from his portrayal of American society and how it will inevitably lead to the tragic end of every character trying to survive. Despite the inception of its production dating back to before 1968, Night of the Living Dead is still the first film to truly capture this idea and feeling of declension. The best point of comparison for Living Dead would be Wes Craven's exploitation classic, The Last House on the Left. Similar to Living Dead, the film was shot in a handheld newsreel style, and it was also used to amplify the film's shocking acts of violence, acts that went way beyond what was in Night of the Living Dead. Craven himself said that the film was largely inspired by footage of the Vietnam War, and he also loads the film with images reminiscent of visual iconography from the war. Craven's goal in Last House on the Left was to show the same kind of brutality that was omnipresent in Vietnam take place in Middle America. Much of the film's violence takes place in a forest setting as a stand-in for the Vietnamese jungle, showing the immutable violence within America itself. And, in a similar manner to Living Dead, showing the corruption that exists at the heart of American society. Night of the Living Dead is often cited as being the birth of modern American horror, and went further than most American films had ever gone before in its attempts to shock the audience. But above all, it was a film with substance, a film with ideas, and a film firmly rooted in the radical politics of its day, which is, I think, the reason why, 50 years on, the film continues to captivate audiences. Thanks for watching.